Mary Shelley quoted John Milton's Paradise Lost for Frankenstein's epigraph. As we see in the Eden complex, a scientist striving to be godlike always prompts moral issues like those we associate with religion. Shelley in Frankenstein and Wells in works like The War of the Worlds and a famous short story called The Star used religious allusion to generalize their thematic concerns. Olaf Stapledon, an admirer of Wells, genuinely spiritual but in no orthodox way religious, wrote the seminal scripture of science fiction, a book called Star Maker. Young Arthur C. Clarke, later author of the classic parable The Star, was moved by both Wells and Stapledon. Few science fiction works, however, uphold not only the moral but the canonical aspects of religion. The most religiously important of those is C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, but the most lasting in literary impact is Walter Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. There is a natural resonance between science fiction and religion, as in Zamyatin's We with its 40 chapters, its Avenue 40. The fact that Zamyatin's father was a Russian Orthodox priest may have made the religious tradition more available to him, but even if that were not the case, science and religion are much alike in that both aim to ameliorate human life, either through explanation, instruction, or promise. The epigraph of Frankenstein, Did I Ask You to Make Me Man?, drawn from Paradise Lost, helps us see how such amelioration is often problematic. The Eden complex naturally echoes this resonance, especially in the constituent elements of natural limits, there are things man was not meant to know, do not disobey, and disobedience. Verne's heroic Nemo is in fact a man without a country. Both science with space and religion with its astronomical contrasts of scale exploit astronomy, exploit enormous rhetorical differences. Remember in the beginning of The War of the Worlds, across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish. Intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. That diminution, that astronomical diminution, does not depend upon science fiction. Here is Psalm 114. Israel went out of Egypt. Judah, that is to say, the Hebrews, was his sanctuary, the land of Judah, and Israel his dominion. The sea saw it and fled. Jordan, that is the river, was driven back. The mountains skipped like rams, and the little hills like lambs. What ailed thee, O thou sea, that thou fleddest? In fact, whole mountains turned to little animals in the face of God. What we see is a natural reason between science fiction and religion to use these enormous changes of scale. But science and religion, after all, may conflict because they are different ways of knowing based on different notions of authority. Perhaps his most famous story, The 9 Billion Names of God, shows Arthur C. Clarke exploring this. He has two characters who are computer technicians. Now remember, this is in the early days of computers. They ran a lot more slowly than computers run now. A llama, that is to say a Dalai Lama type of llama, shows up in New York and asks a computing company to set up a computer program that will generate all of the possible combinations of their 9-letter alphabet, which they have carefully constructed, in which can be produced all of the names of God. They believe that when all of the names of God have been enumerated, the universe will become perfect. And that is the role of this sect on the earth. The two Americans are sent to fulfill this contract, and they go off to the mountains of Tibet, and they set up their computer, and they start it running, and it needs to run for about 3 months, so they stay there. watching it run, tending to it, but they know that sooner or later the program is going to come to the end, and when they get to the end, they know that the llamas are going to be very disappointed. So just before the end, they get onto their donkeys and start going down the mountain. As they go down the mountain in the nighttime, they look, and down below them they see the battered old DC-3 at the end of the runway, like a tiny silver cross. I think that reminder of the dominant religion of the West is not immaterial. They continue on down, understanding that nothing will happen. And then one says, well, in an hour we should be there and be able to take off on the plane. Chuck didn't reply, so George swung round in his saddle. He could just see Chuck's face, a white oval turned toward the sky. "Look," whispered Chuck, and George lifted his eyes to heaven. There is always a last time for everything. Overhead, without any fuss, the stars were going out. This is an interesting and problematic story because, after all, it doesn't say that Western science was wrong. Western science, after all, provided the machine that made possible the permutations of the alphabet that gave us the 9 billion names of God. And yet, somehow, the relation between East and West is not comfortable. One flees from the other. What the story asks us to do is understand that we live in a freighted world where there are things beyond our knowing, and we must be careful of what we do. It's a spiritual world. Science fiction can use religion allusively to indicate the weight of the moral issues of the fiction. Shelley uses both quotation and subtler allusion to connect her modern story with Milton. Wells uses both quotation and allusion, as we discussed previously in The Island of Dr. Moreau, for example. The law, do not suck liquid, are we not men? Do not eat flesh, are we not men? That litany reminds us of the use of religion as a tool of colonial repression. In The War of the Worlds, the parodic vision of the 3 Martian machines with the dead Martians hanging out of them on a hilltop is a reminder of Calvary. It's not that Shelley and Wells actually are religious. They are not, in fact. They are thoroughly secular. But they employ religion to strengthen their moral discussions, not to argue for any particular religion or even, in fact, for spirituality in general. Shelley sees the community as the moral authority guiding individuals. Wells sees the pitfalls of pride and the necessity of integrating the head and the heart. Science fiction can use religion to make a fundamentally spiritual argument, although one not necessarily tied to the practice or institutions of any particular religion. Wells wrote a great story called The Star. It's a fascinating story told from a general viewpoint in which the scientists look at some heated body, some light-emitting body that's coming closer and closer to the Earth. At first, the scientists, always wrong, think that it's immaterial. Then they begin to see as it grows bigger that it may actually pass near us. Then they think that it may, in fact, collide with us. In fact, what happens is this huge astronomical body flings itself by us and then, around the gravitational pull of the sun, disappears again. Suddenly, the narration changes, and it says, Martian astronomers, for there are astronomers on Mars, looked down and saw how little the basic outlines had changed, of the size of the polar caps, for example, or the boundaries of the oceans, which only goes to show, the story ends, how minute the greatest of human tragedies can appear when seen from an adequate distance. Now, this star that appears in the sky and tells us that we're wrong, we understand throughout the reading of Wells's The Star, harkens back to the star that led the wise men to the manger, the star over Bethlehem. Arthur C. Clarke wrote his story, The Star, in part inspired by Stapledon's spirituality and in part as a response to Wells's The Star. Clarke's The Star begins, "It is 3,000 light years to the Vatican. Once I believed that space could have no power over faith, just as I believed that the heavens declare the glory of God's handiwork." The I in this story is the astrogator, the navigational chief of an expedition sent out in the future to go to a burned-out planet that's been discovered around a burned-out star. He is himself a Jesuit. Well, Jesuits are known for their academic excellence, and it's not a stretch to think that someone who believes in God may also be an adequately excellent scientist, that he goes on such an expedition. They get to that planet, 3,000 light years from Earth, and they discover the remnants of a glorious civilization, one that was clearly destroyed when that star went nova. Our viewpoint character understands what that means, and his faith is shaken. As the story ends, he asks, what was the need, implicitly God, what was the need to give these people to the fire, that the symbol of their passing might shine above Bethlehem? There's no getting away from the world of science. And science fiction makes us understand that even if we urge ourselves toward religion, we may in fact have to confront it in ways that religion sometimes makes uncomfortable. Olaf Stapledon, who was an extramural lecturer in philosophy for the Open University in England, wrote a book called Star Maker. It's a hard book to read these days because it has no dialogue. But it was, in fact, a bestseller at its time because if one reads it slowly, with care, it is indeed a great work of poetry. Beyond that, it has been called the great gray holy book of science fiction. It begins, "One night, when I had tasted bitterness, I went out onto the hill. Dark heather checked my feet. Below marched the suburban street lamps. Windows, their curtains drawn, were shut eyes, inwardly watching the lives of dreams. Beyond the sea's level darkness, a lighthouse pulsed. Overhead, obscurity." That word bitterness is crucial for this speaker, the I. The very next paragraph says, "I distinguished our own house, our islet, in the tumultuous and bitter currents of the world." And the third paragraph begins, "All this surely was good." He thinks of the, quote, "intricate symbiosis between himself and his wife. And yet there was a bitterness." So the paragraphs begin with bitterness, bitterness, bitterness. Something has driven him away from his home this night, and yet he knows that in theory his relationship with his wife should be perfect, should be something upon which he relies. Indeed, there's a passage somewhat later in the book in which he says that they two had grown together like trees planted too closely together, mutually distorting and mutually supporting. It is indeed a poetic book. The Divine Comedy by Dante tells the story of a poet who goes out onto a hillside and has somehow a journey overtake him. This is how the Divine Comedy begins. "Midway the journey of this life, I was ware that I had strayed into a dark forest," perhaps heather checked his feet, "and the right path appeared not anywhere. Ah, tongue cannot describe how it oppressed this wood, so harsh, dismal, and wild that fear at thought of it strikes now into my breast. Oh, bitter it is! Death is scarce bitterer." This term bitter recurs a number of times at the very beginning of the Divine Comedy, and no explanation is given for Dante, the poet's character is named Dante, feeling this bitterness any more than an explanation is given for the bitterness of the first-person narrator in Star Maker. Most people who read Star Maker don't recognize the allusion to Dante, but I think it's an important one. Dante's Inferno takes us on a trip where Dante is led by his predecessor epic poet, Virgil, and he sees one person after another suffering for all eternity, and he hears their stories, all very interesting. Then Virgil takes him to Purgatorio, to Limbo, where he sees another set of people all suffering, hears their stories, all very interesting, but these people at least eventually can purge themselves of their sins and move on to paradise. Paradiso, however, is not a place that Virgil can take Dante because Virgil lived before Jesus and therefore had not the benefit of being a true Christian. He'll have to wait until Judgment Day. Virgil hands Dante off to Beatrice, his on earth object of admiration, the same Beatrice whose name is used in Rappaccini's Daughter by Hawthorne, and Beatrice takes him through paradise, in which he sees people enjoying heaven, and he hears their stories. Not as interesting. But at the very end, or I should say just before the very end, Beatrice shows Dante an image of all of heaven. All of the stars come together and they swirl around until they form an enormous glowing rose. The rose being the single most important medieval icon for the Virgin Mary. Seeing the blazing light of that rose composed of all the stars of the universe, suddenly Dante falls back and finds himself on precisely the hillside on which he began. In Stapledon's story, we have overhead obscurity. Then, seeing nothing, the narrator goes on. He contemplates the intricate symbiosis of his marriage. He acknowledges his bitterness. He acknowledges that his bitterness is not well justified. He thinks about this us, and suddenly, overhead obscurity unveiled a star. He thinks about that star and he realizes that we poor humans must understand some sense of awe in looking up there. And he realizes that even though there is bitterness, nonetheless, the heart praised. Overhead, obscurity was now in full retreat. He sits on that hillside and takes what he calls the hawk flight of imagination. I perceived that I was on a little round grain of rock and metal, filmed with water and with air, whirling in sunlight and darkness, and on the skin of that little grain, all the swarms of men, generation by generation, had lived in labor and blindness, with intermittent joy and intermittent lucidity of spirit, and all their history with its folk wanderings, its empires, its philosophies, its proud sciences, its social revolutions, its increasing hunger for community was but a flicker in one day of the lives of stars. This is astronomical scales, and that writing style is characteristic of Stapledon. He uses one word after another to get us to go to a larger and larger and larger and larger thing until suddenly he projects it all down into something so small that we realize awe. This is that speaker. It turns out that the speaker finds that he can think his way to other places. He goes at first to what's called the other earth, and he sees people much like us, except that smell and taste are their major senses instead of sight, and interesting satire again about our earth transpires. But what's more important is that he merges with the mind of a philosopher who lives there, and together they come to have a new insight and are able to go even further afield. And again, we have this rush of language until we are projected into something new, and then further afield, and again, and further afield, and again, and further afield, until eventually his mind is participating in living cosmoses, whole living galaxies, living stars. Along the way, he learns that it's not just an accident. The key beings of this universe are a symbiotic race of arachnoids, kind of spider-like creatures, and ichthyoids, whale-like creatures that live in huge spacefaring sea bubbles. And the arachnoids live merging into the back of them, but then can go off and do things on their own. This intricate symbiosis of the two whole species is the most utopian, a-utopian, in the entire universe. And it is they who have projected themselves back onto that original hillside, seen this man's honesty and understanding the importance of symbiosis, and allowed him to grow and grow and grow until he is so capacious as part of all of these minds that he experiences the supreme moment of the cosmos. He, in his multiplicity, confronts Star Maker, who makes universe after universe and discards each when it's done, for he is not only star maker, but star destroyer. Virtue in the creature is not the same as virtue in the creator, and we must learn to praise. At that point, he falls back to his hillside, and he realizes that his marriage is a microcosm of the most utopian possibility in the universe. The book is published in 1937 when, as it says in the preface, the whole world is aware of the possibility of conflagration. At that key moment when we are approaching World War II, people must decide, do we want ego and bitterness, or do we want to seek symbiosis? This story is indeed a perpetually interesting spiritual tale, but it's written out of the need for applying the spirit in our world to a crucial political moment. Science fiction can use religion to make a fundamentally religious argument, not simply a widely spiritual argument. But this is rare. C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, that has mystic beings and goes on is set on what we think of as Earth, Venus, and Mars, is such a work, such a trilogy. It's motivated by David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, which is a fundamentally Gnostic vision of spacefaring. But Lewis clearly has written an orthodox Christian story that, frankly, doesn't appeal much to science fiction fans, although it is popular among committed Christians. On that basis, Dr. Ransom is wounded, hounded by Professor Weston, Western culture with its science and so on, the tiny cross of the DC-3, and he dies for us. But ultimately, it's too doctrinaire. On the other hand, A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller has been in print constantly and delighting people ever since it was published first at the end of the 1950s. This story was originally published in 3 parts, although it's somewhat modified when it came out in book form. The story is set 600 years from the present, 600 years after that, and 600 years after that. What happens in our more or less present is a nuclear war that decimates the population of the world. In the first part of the book, called Homo Lux, we have called Fiat Homo, Let There Be Man. We have everything set in a monastery, which is ironically trying to preserve civilization and gets things wrong. They find an old shopping list from some guy named Leibowitz, and they think that it's some sort of metaphoric insight, and they become ultimately the Order of St. Leibowitz. 18 is the number in Jewish mysticism that stands for life. When you say to life, l'chaim, chai, life, is composed of the letters Yud, Chet, which together form the numeral 18. In Babylon, we divided the sky and then, therefore, all circles into 360 degrees, because 360 was the closest they could come to the real length of the year, 365, and still have 12 nice months for the rising and setting of the moon, hence the 12 signs of the zodiac. 360, right across the center, is 180. 18 means going from darkness to light, from winter to summer. This story takes 18 centuries from the present, and it brings us ultimately to a new kind of light, a new kind of life. It begins with nuclear disaster. We see the reduced civilization 600 years from now. Then, in the second passage, fiat lux, let there be light, people are beginning to rediscover science. And indeed, the conflict between the authority of the church and the authority of the religion is clear. Then in the third chapter, fiat voluntas tua, let thy will be done, we wind up having the return of the flame deluge, and it looks like there is another nuclear holocaust. The question is, what will that mean? The first question, of course, is, why are we going back to that again? And the answer is given in the book this way. We're told by one of the abbots, there's an abbot ruling the monastery in each of the three sections, an abbot whose name begins with initial A in the first, P in the second, and Z in the third. We're going through the alphabet. The abbot in the third part says that history is always driven by the conflict of Mary and Martha. Martha and Mary are sisters whose house Jesus visits. Mary sits down at his feet to listen to him. Martha, knowing the obligations of a host, goes and tries to get food. She comes in, sees Mary at Jesus' feet, and complains, and Jesus says, this is not ambiguous, he's quite clear, Martha, you are too cumbered about that which is unnecessary. Mary knows that which is necessary. But the reality is, in most of our lives, you can't always be in the exact presence of God and listen to his words fresh that moment. At some point, we need to eat. There is a practical side to life. And the balance between the practical and the spiritual always leads to a certain kind of conflict. In fact, that's the conflict that drives the cyclicism of history, according to this book. By the way, their brother is Lazarus, the one Jesus brings back from the dead. The book uses liturgical language, primarily Latin, as you hear in the chapter titles, fiat homo, let there be man, fiat lux, let there be light, and fiat voluntas tua, but also Greek. There is an ironic version of a Kyrie, and Hebrew, in fact, throughout. I think what Miller is trying to do by linking the passages of the book, and even within passages, is show us that he's not so concerned with a particular religion as he is with a recognition of the importance of religious language. We need to be able to say things that acknowledge religion. At the very center of the book, the very center, the middle page of the book, we have two lines of Hebrew. One is Pe matkinin ohelim, which a character who recurs over the entire period of the book, sort of a wandering Jew character, translates for the Christian who can't read it as tents mended here. It turns out that's right. It does mean tents mended here. It's not a biblical reference at all. And yet, we have this from the book of Kings. So when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them, the people answered the king, saying, What portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to thine own house, David. So Israel departed unto their tents. The wandering Jew character spends his time waiting through 18 centuries, as did the famous wandering Jew, for a second coming. On the facing page, still in the center of the book, we get Shema Yisrael Hashem Eloheinu Hashem Echad, the beginning of the Shema, what is called the central prayer of Judaism. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This phrase is written on the back side of a stone, the front side of which says, tents mended here. If the world comes into accord such that we can understand that the world's powers are allowing the spiritual to develop, then God will be one, and the end of the world will come about as it should. There are three endings to this book. One is an ending in which a brother Joshua, like the Joshua who went in and took the land of Canaan for the Israelites, for the Hebrews, leads a group of children off the earth just before the nuclear holocaust. The second ending is the creation by this radiation of a girl named Rachel, a name that stands metaphorically for patience, who has green eyes and needs no baptism, but instead offers to baptize the now dying abbot of the last part of the book. We have returned to Eden, now not with a first man, but a first woman. And finally, we have this, a story, a passage about a shark. Now, you need to understand that the first chapter ends with this: the buzzards laid their eggs in season and lovingly fed their young. For all things there is a season and a purpose under heaven, as we're told in Ecclesiastes. The buzzard, who lives off carrion, is a scavenger, an ironic version of the bird that stands for the Holy Spirit. At the end of the second section, we have the wild black scavengers of the sky laid their eggs in season. So again, we've returned to these buzzards. The buzzards, however, metamorphose at the end of the book as a whole. A wind came across the ocean, chilling it. A pall fell down. The breakers washed dead shrimp ashore. The whiting was washed up. But the shark, an inversion of the fish that stands for Jesus, the shark swam out to his deepest waters and brooded in the cold, clean currents. That word brood has two meanings: gave birth and worried. He was very hungry that season. This is not the end of the world, but again, God in his wonder has scourged us for our good. Science fiction and religion do go together, and perhaps its greatest work, both as secular and as religious combination, is Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz.